Hey everyone, I'm Jason Logston from Amazing Food Made Easy and president of the International Sous Vide Association, and I'm really excited to be speaking at my third Sous Vide Summit. Now today I want to dive into a topic that I think is really fascinating, and that is how does meat actually heat? Because there's always a lot of confusion around this topic, especially with sous vide. In my Exploring Sous Vide group, we get a ton of questions along the line of, how long do I cook my steak? So go ahead and answer in the comments here. How long should I actually sous vide a steak for? What you're normally going to see is a wide range of answers. For example, some of the answers from my Facebook group were 45 minutes, 2 hours, 1 hour, an hour per inch, but no one can really seem to agree on what the right answer is, and we're ranging here from 45 minutes to 3 hours. So what's really happening here? That's what I wanted to dive into today. 15 minutes from now, you're going to have a much firmer grasp of how meat heats and have a lot of ammo for your next social media argument. But first, when does this actually apply? The information generally does apply to all types of meat. There's a slight variation here and there between different kinds, but it's important to remember that this really only helps with one of the goals of cooking food. Now, there's 3 potential goals when you're cooking. The first goal is to heat meat through. This applies to things like traditional steaks, many types of fish, good pork chops. If you're cooking an entire beef tenderloin, cooking is more nuanced than this, but it's basically anything you'd feel safe eating raw. Beef tartare and sushi, for example. But even though you can eat things raw, many times we prefer to heat it to a specific temperature because of how it changes the proteins in the meat in either an appetizing way or just increases the temperature in your mouth. Now you can argue which version is better as long as you want, but cold pizza does not taste the same as hot pizza. And this goal, heating the food through, is what the majority of today's presentation is all about. The second goal is to make food safe to eat. This is usually through pasteurization. It applies to things like chicken breasts, turkey, less good pork chops, so you want to make sure are extra safe, some fish even. These are things that you would not want to eat raw, and then they could make you really sick if you do. Today's presentation also applies to a lot of these items, because the pasteurization times are based on the thickness as well. So knowing how long something takes to heat can be really helpful when you're trying to figure out how long to pasteurize for. The third goal is simply to make things tender. This applies to anything you traditionally braise, smoke, barbecue, cook low and slow, like pot roast, barbecue brisket, pulled pork, anything you have to cook over a longer period of time. Throwing some thick short ribs on the grill and heating them through will still result in an incredibly tough piece of meat, even though they are hot. You really need to tenderize them. Today's talk doesn't apply to this goal too much, because honestly, does it really matter if your short ribs heated through after 2 hours or after 3 hours, when you're cooking them for another 72 hours regardless? But if you cook those short ribs for 72 hours and then chill them, you can use everything we're talking about today to know exactly how long to reheat them for the next day, saving you a lot of time. So this presentation will be highly focused on this first goal, heating it through, because it's fascinating in its own right, and it applies to a lot of the other goals as well. So back to figuring out how long does it take to heat your meat. There's a few things that go into this, but the biggest one is pretty simple and even makes intuitive sense, which is nice. And that is that the thickness of the food matters. How thick is the steak? It's the most important aspect for determining how long it's going to take to heat something through. This isn't just a sous vide thing. If you've ever tried to cook a double thick pork chop on a ripping hot grill, you know how hard it is to get the center up to temperature without charring the outside of it completely. It's a lot harder with a double thick pork chop than it is with a thin pork chop, right? But with sous vide, we have the added benefit of not overcooking the food, at least from a temperature perspective, and we know the exact temperature we're cooking at, which makes it a lot easier and we have a lot more leeway. But that first question you need to ask yourself when you're starting to sous vide a tender cut is, how thick is it? Now, one of the tools we created is our sous vide timing ruler. It's made specifically to help with this. You can also use a regular ruler and make sure you wash the raw beef off of it before your kids start playing with it again. But we put the ruler together. It's a lot easier for people to use it at home. You can wash it in the sink. I've even run it through the dishwasher, though we don't recommend it necessarily. And you can get that at afmeasy.com/timing. And through the end of the conference, you can actually get 20% off the ruler if you use the code SUMMIT20. I'll put that in the comments as well. Once you know the thickness, it is easy to figure out how long to cook it for. There's tables like this one for red meat and pork, chicken and poultry, and fish. This was spearheaded by Nathan Myhrvold and Douglas Baldwin's work in the eGullet message boards more than a decade ago when I was just getting started. And it's one of the main reasons they are both in the Sous Vide Hall of Fame today. Now there's several tables adapted from their work. On my website, I have several streamlined and simplified charts that work for the majority of cooks, as well as that timing ruler I showed you. You can check out all these charts at afmeasy.com/thickness. Or if you really want to dive into the science and thermodynamics of meat, I highly recommend checking out Douglas Baldwin's website directly. But looking at my ruler, here's some of the times, which are also in my free online charts. So if we look at this first column, a slab of meat out of the fridge. A slab is just a steak-like shape compared to like a tenderloin or a roast, which is more cylindrical, and that heats slightly differently. It's actually in the next column next to it if you want to compare. But down at the bottom, you can actually see a 1/2 inch thick steak, which takes about 30 minutes to heat through, and that's it. So that's shorter than all the times that most people recommend it. But if you double that thickness, the time more than doubles. It's now at 1 hour and 15 minutes, so it's about 2.5 times longer. Double that thickness again to a nice thick 2-inch steak, hopefully a ribeye. Just sous vide that, throw it on the grill. It's going to be amazing. We're now looking though at 3.5 hours. Again, it's more than 2.5 times longer than a 1-inch thick steak. So if that steak you asked about in the Facebook group was 2 inches thick, then every recommendation you were given above was wrong. If it was a 1/2 inch thick, then they were all too long. Though people don't realize this due to some interesting things we're going to talk about next. But for now, we know what the final answer is for how long to heat a steak for. You simply measure the thickness and you cook it for however long one of those reputable tables says. That's really all that there is to it for tender cuts of beef, lamb, and other red meats. People try to make things so complicated, but anything that just needs to be heated through will work perfectly using this method. There are also similar tables for pasteurization of chicken, pork, and turkey that we'll get into, but they use the same principle. So simply measure the thickness, look up the time, and you are done. So why is there so much confusion? It's because, like most things, especially in cooking, what works all the time is usually a pretty big simplification, but it's accurate enough for almost all cooks, especially home cooks that don't have to deal with a HACCP plan like a professional chef would. But for fun, let's look at all the weird stuff that's going on that tends to confuse people. All this weird and nuanced stuff is really where people tend to go down rabbit holes on social media, arguing with each other, trying to sound smart about stuff that honestly really doesn't matter much, especially to that poor parent that just wanted to know how long to cook their dinner for. So while we cover this, just keep in mind that all you really need to know is what we've already discussed. Measure it, look it up, and cook it. For tender foods, thickness equals time. And now, on to the weirdness. The first thing you might notice is that there's no mention of the temperature you're heating your food to on my ruler. We have the shape of the food, whether it's frozen or not, but we have nothing about the final temperature. And that's because it just doesn't matter, which to me is really weird, right? If you're going to 120 or 130 or 140, it's all the same. Now, I don't know how universal this is across all possible temperatures from absolute zero to like the center of the sun, but if you take that really teeny range that we use for sous vide, it all behaves the same. So for heating meat, you don't have to worry about the ending temperature. But as I've said, today we're concerned with goal number 1, heating your food through. Once we start talking about goal number 2, making that food safe through pasteurization, then the end temperature does matter. And that's because high temperatures pasteurize things faster, but they still heat through at the same rate, which leads to some really interesting timing. So this 1-inch thick timing also generally applies to chicken breasts. It's a picture of a steak here, but it does apply to chicken. And it also heats through in about 1 hour and 15 minutes. But now, because we want to pasteurize it, we have to throw the temperature into the mix. So remember this 1 hour and 15 minute time while we switch to the chicken pasteurization times. So here we have the same 1-inch thickness of the meat that heats through in an hour and 15 minutes. But if you're cooking it at 137, it's going to take 2 hours and 15 minutes to pasteurize it. So once you get it to temperature, you have to hold it there for about a full hour after it's been heated through. If you just heat it through, it will not be safe to eat. It's still got a lot of that bad stuff living on it and in it, and it needs that extra hour until it's safe. But if you bump that temperature up to 145, then due to the hotter temperature, it will be pasteurized and safe after that hour and 15 minutes. So heating through and pasteurization times converge at that point, but only for that thickness. But get ready for more weirdness. Let's bump that temperature up to 149 degrees. It'll be safe to eat now after 55 minutes, even though it's not heated all the way through yet. Awesome, right? You can shave off all this time, even though it's not heated through to the temperature you want. And that's because once the middle of that chicken got to the 130, 135 range, the pasteurization process was in full effect and going pretty quick. And it completed while the chicken was still on its way up to the final temperature of 149. So the center of your chicken, in this case, is probably going to be around 140, not 149 after 55 minutes. So you're going to want to let it go longer if you wanted to get up to the texture of 149. Now, on the other side, the starting temperature does matter, but this only holds true if the food is frozen, because it's not the difference in temperature that really matters. It's because in physics, weird stuff happens when something goes from frozen to liquid. So those times are a lot different, but the end temperature still doesn't matter. So let's compare times. Looking at frozen, it adds about 50% to the cook times. A 1/2-inch thick steak takes about 40 minutes instead of 30 minutes. A 1-inch thick steak takes about 2 hours instead of an hour and 15 minutes. And that 2-inch thick steak is now up to 5.5 hours instead of 3.5 hours. Again, the thicker the food, the more of an impact cooking from frozen has. But a good rule of thumb is to add about 50% more time to the cooking time. So now you can easily cook your steaks from frozen. Just don't tell Chef David Petranczyk. Then the next thing is, these look like exact times, right? But they are not. It's so important to remember that these are estimates. Depending on the piece of meat you have, the circulation in your bath, the hardness of your water, and the fat content of the meat, it can all affect the heating times. You can't really know the truly exact times of how long it's going to take to heat unless you know the thermal diffusivity, the heat transfer coefficient, the density of the food, the specific heats of all the elements involved. It's crazy. Now, none of this really matters to a normal cook, but some people love to talk about it and argue about it. So if you see a chart that recommends 55 minutes, don't hold it as gospel. Just know it's a good rule of thumb and it should be used as a minimum time. Because remember, this is sous vide. You have a wide range of time before your food gets over-tenderized, so exact timing rarely matters. Sure, if you take the amazing Crea class with AJ and Bruno so you can make 3-star Michelin meals, then you might want to be pretty dang exact and use a probe so you can take it out as soon as it hits that core temperature. But for the rest of us, don't stress about it. Sure, that 1-inch thick strip steak heats through in an hour and 15 minutes, but it's still amazing after 3 hours. Oh, and if you're cooking above 130, then after 3 hours, that strip steak is also pasteurized, and it's now safe for anyone to eat, even if they have a weakened immune system, or if it was from Costco and blade tenderized. Also, a little bit of tenderization, even for tender cuts, can be a great thing. Sure, you can just heat a sirloin steak or a strip steak through, but another 3 to 5 hours tenderizes it just enough that I enjoy it even more. So this to-the-minute accuracy people are so concerned about rarely matters to most cooks. Again, this might be different if you are a Michelin-starred chef. Then that little last percent of quality probably does matter to you. Another point people forget a lot is that I'm not writing a scientific article. Neither are most other food writers. We are cooks. This seems to come into a shock to a lot of critics, but we're simply trying to help people make great food. So yeah, I err on going a tad too long or a tad too odd for safety reasons. I use rounded numbers to make it easier on you. I generalize the science so people don't get confused with things that don't really matter for making great food in most cases. My charts and rulers and articles are guides to help you make amazing food. If you follow them, your food will be incredible. If you use them as data in your college physics course, you are going to fail. Sorry. So if you want to argue with me that my time is off by 38 seconds or a few minutes, or my degree conversion isn't exact, then great. Have a blast. But my response will be, it just doesn't matter to most cooks. So you shouldn't stress about it. Another real fun aspect is that all these charts that you see are actually the time it takes to heat to 1 degree less than your water bath temperature. Which is why I love when people argue about a degree or two of doneness in their steak and they're quoting these charts in the same breath, because they're almost always arguing against themselves. But why is this true? Why do these charts go 1 degree Fahrenheit less? Because I think it's fascinating. And it's because the rate at which meat heats is not uniform. We often think of meat heating like this. I know I did. If it takes, say, 2 hours to heat through, then after an hour, it's halfway there. But the reality is that it heats on a curve. In a 2-hour cook, after an hour, the meat is about 80% of the way heated already. This blew my mind when I first learned it at that CREA course, because it's so counterintuitive to what I thought and the mental model that I had of what meat does. To highlight this for you all, I measured a 2.5 thick piece of meat, so a big honking one here, and I put it in a bath with a probe in it. Now the charts say it should take about 5 hours and 10 minutes to heat all the way through. Here's the graph of the actual temperature over time and the data for the last 3 hours of that cook. Now I was pretty happy that at the bottom you can see that it took 4 hours and 57 minutes, so it's pretty dang close to what my chart said that it should. My guess is that most of the difference was actually because my probe wasn't exactly in the middle of the meat. I don't quite have the refined technique that AJ does for properly probing your food. But look at this data. It's crazy to me. Of those 5 hours, a full hour of it was going from 130 to 131. And 25 minutes was going from 129 to 130. That means if you were happy with a 129 degree steak, you could have actually pulled it out of the bath in 3.5 hours instead of 5 hours. That's an hour and a half you just shaved off your cooking time. Altogether, the last 2 hours of cooking only raised the temperature 5 degrees, from 126 to 131. In comparison, the first 2 hours of cooking raised the temperature 70 degrees. So 2 hours in, we were already at 114 degrees, just 80% of the way to our final temperature. So as you get closer and closer to the target temperature, the heating process gets slower and slower and slower. I think it's modernist cuisine that theorizes that due to the ambient heat loss, the core of the food never gets up to the temperature of the water bath. Or thermometers just aren't exact enough, so they eventually give up and round it off. Dang lazy thermometers, always slacking on the job. This is also why that chicken breast we pasteurized earlier only took 55 minutes to be safe, even though it had it heated through, because it got up into the 140 degree Fahrenheit range pretty dang quickly. And chicken only needs to be held there for like 10 to 20 minutes to be safe to eat. So this is all well and good, right? But where can this weirdness actually apply to you? Because while I like talking about it, it's fun to share the science. Some of this can actually apply and make your cooking faster and a little bit easier. We call it Delta T cooking. That's taking advantage of the difference in heating times, is where the phrase Delta T cooking comes from. You might have heard it from Dave Petranczyk from PolyScience, AJ Schaller, or Gerard from CREA, but what it basically boils down to is that you set the temperature of your water bath above what you want your food to come out at, which greatly accelerates the cooking process. At the most basic, maybe you like your steaks medium rare, but instead of setting it at 131, you set it at 132. It's a 1 degree difference, and your steak will be done 15 to 20% faster. And most people will never be able to tell the difference between the parts of the meat that do get up to 132 instead of 131. So there's really no loss in quality. Here's a few other attempts that are easy to do at home. And again, these are estimated time savings. If you want to be 100% exact, if you're following a HACCP plan, then a probe is required. But for most home cooks, it's more than fine estimating it, and you won't even notice the difference. If you set it at 2 degrees over, it reduces the cooking time by about 25 to 30%. At 4 degrees, you're now reducing it by 30 to 40%. And I think at 4 degrees, you're right on the edge where people might be able to tell a slight difference in the doneness, especially in a side-by-side test. But the meat will still come out as expected, and most people will never notice the difference. Now, above 4 degrees of a difference, though, your time savings are much smaller, and the difference becomes much more noticeable if your timing isn't spot on. So I don't recommend going above this without a probe. At the most complex level, you can start to use a probe to monitor that core temperature. Some devices, like the Innova Precision Oven and the Polyscience Hydro Pro Plus, have built-in probes and cooking programs that can set the bath 10 to 20 to 30 degrees higher until the core nears the temperature. Then they automatically reduce the water temperature so it doesn't overcook the food. Once you sear the outside, the little temperature difference is still not noticeable, but you can shave 50 to 60% off the cook times doing that. As I said, for that advanced Delta T cooking, you really need a probe, and Chef David Petranczyk has a great article about doing that. But for a 1 to 4 degree difference, you can pretty easily wing it and knock off the amount of time needed, greatly speeding up your food prep. Now, these time reductions also come into play for reheating food. Now, most food doesn't have to be served at the cooking temperature. So you've already cooked your steak to 135, you can then chill it, put it in the fridge for a few days, and then when you want to reheat it, set that circulator to 135, but pull it at like the halfway or 2/3 mark of the timing, knowing that that core is going to be within about 10 degrees, 5 degrees maybe, which is more than hot enough to serve it, especially once you put a good sear on it. So now you know how long to cook a steak, a lamb chop, a pork chop, or a piece of fish for, and even pasteurized chicken and poultry. You know how to speed up your times a little bit and get the most out of your sous vide machine. But remember, measure the thickness, look it up in a chart, and you're ready to go. At the most basic level, that's all you need to know. But now you also know all the science and nuances that everyone else is arguing about while you're enjoying your perfectly cooked meal. For more details on sous vide cooking, please check out my free Quick Start class at afmeasy.com/quickstart or any of my cookbooks at afmeasy.com/books, or they're all available on Amazon as well. Thanks a lot for joining me, and until next time, I'm Jason Logston.